When someone says it was the best thing that ever happened to me, you would not be at fault for imagining that the person is talking about meeting the love of their life or the birth of their child. What you're probably not thinking is that they were referring to a car accident that left them paraplegic. And yet, these are the words of Jerry, a 34-year-old paraplegic man who's been disabled for 8 years following a car accident. That's wild, right? Jerry's story is an example of what's known as post-traumatic growth, and it's the topic of today's video. We'll cover some history and background on post-traumatic growth theory and how it came to be, along with 5 ways to facilitate post-traumatic growth in your life, and 5 broad areas of life where people typically experience post-traumatic growth. And at the end, I'm going to share with you the most critical ingredient for making post-traumatic growth happen in your life, according to the co-creator of the theory. So make sure to stick around for that. For me personally, the idea and concept of post-traumatic growth is an exciting idea to talk about because as a trauma therapist, my ultimate goal is to help clients overcome and heal from trauma. In other words, in this context, my work is to help clients get to the post-traumatic growth part in their lives. Hi there, I'm Ashley Phillips and I'm a practicing trauma therapist and the founder of the Kelowna EMDR clinic. If you are new to this channel, welcome. Here I post out videos about trauma, my experience in private practice, and my favorite modality, EMDR therapy. Let's dive in. So we'll begin with the origin story of the theory of post-traumatic growth. And to set the scene, let's look at more of what Jerry, the 34-year-old paraplegic man, said of his experience as he recounted in the book, Trauma and Transformation, Growing in the Aftermath of Suffering. This was the one thing that happened in my life that I needed to have happened. It was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. If I had to do it all over again, I would want it to happen the same way. Now, what's fascinating is that Jerry is not an outlier. There are many examples in research literature where an individual who experienced a deeply traumatic event, like a serious accident or a life-threatening illness, views the event as an integral, indispensable, and defining part of their life. This is something that the founders of the post-traumatic growth theory picked up on as well. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun both were clinical psychologists, researchers, and educators at the University of North Carolina. They heard stories of people who became blind or paralyzed or experienced some other big traumatic event in their life, but seemed to be dealing with it very well. So they made it their research area of focus, and about 10 years later, in the mid-1990s, they coined the term post-traumatic growth. They defined post-traumatic growth as a positive change experienced as a result of the struggle with a major life crisis or traumatic event. Now, as great as post-traumatic growth is, and inspiring and encouraging as it can be to see people use trauma as a catalyst for growth, I want to be very, very clear that this is not meant to glorify trauma or make it seem like trauma is good. I would never wish it upon anyone, and yet people have said how it changed their lives in a positive way. So by no means should you seek out trauma in order to experience personal growth in your life. That's just not the lesson here. Now that we've covered what post-traumatic growth is and how the theory came to be, let's talk about how people can get from trauma to growth. Tedeschi and Calhoun have identified 5 distinct mechanisms that facilitate and foster post-traumatic growth. Let's go over them. The first is cognitive processing of what happened to you. Another way you can think of this as gaining awareness and education of what trauma is causing to happen in your body. So instead of feeling simply dysregulated and anxious and angry, you have an understanding that there are certain hormones and chemicals that are circulating in your body that are part of the trauma response to certain triggers, so that you can begin to have a new perspective and observe what is happening in your body than simply being in it. The second mechanism that helps foster post-traumatic growth is emotional regulation. When you're emotionally regulated, you can deliberately put yourself in the growth state of mind, and this facilitates progress instead of remaining in the fixed state of mind. You can, for example, begin seeing obstacles that you are facing as opportunities. When you're emotionally regulated, you are actually breaking the typical trauma response patterns that keep us stuck. And that's why learning emotional regulation strategies is an important part of trauma therapy. The third helpful mechanism is disclosure, which is being able to talk about and share what happened to you and the effect it has had on your life. When you do that, on top of being emotionally regulated, you can acknowledge that, what has happened, what it is, without making it more than or less than. It's leading to acceptance of what happened. Now, acceptance does not mean giving into trauma and giving up. It simply means acknowledging where you are, accepting it for what it is as you continue your progress towards where you want to go. The fourth mechanism that facilitates post-traumatic growth is narrative development, where you can look at trauma that happened to you in a novel way or kind of create a new story of what it means for you and the rest of your life. This news story is often a very powerful driver for people, giving them hope, meaning, and purpose. For example, a cancer survivor's initial story could be, I was healthy, now I'm sick, my life is ruined, and no one understands me. And their new narrative is, surviving cancer completely changed my perspective. It made me realize who are the people I want to spend the most time with. I changed my job, and I really have learned not to sweat the small stuff. And finally, the fifth mechanism that facilitates post-traumatic growth is service. This is paying it forward. This is taking care of your fellow humans and your community. This is helping others who experience something similar to you find their own version of post-traumatic growth. Seeing it through this lens really helps explain why someone who has lost a child may start a grief group for other parents, or someone who has survived a mass shooting may start a support group for other gun violence survivors. What is so interesting to me is that all 5 of these mechanisms that facilitate post-traumatic growth, cognitive processing, emotional regulation, disclosure, narrative development, and service, are sort of like rungs on a ladder, with one building on top of the other or making the next one easier. And what I appreciate as a therapist is that there's a clear role that I can play in each of those 5 areas. Now that we've covered the mechanisms that foster post-traumatic growth, let's go over the 5 domains where post-traumatic growth typically manifests in people's lives. The first one is personal strength. This is when people say that they feel that they've become a stronger person as a consequence of what they went through. It's a common sentiment expressed by someone with an increase in personal strength that they may say, if I got through this and that, I can get through anything. The next domain where people can experience post-traumatic growth is in their relationships. People frequently report that they are more open emotionally and they're more empathetic. They can also experience deeper, more meaningful relationships with people in their lives. The third domain is openness to new experiences and opportunities. This can lead to a complete reshuffling of life priorities, saying yes to opportunities that they would have rejected previously, and broadly engaging in novel activities. Another area is gratitude. People can become more appreciative of life and grateful for things they have taken for granted before trauma. And finally, the 5th domain where people can experience post-traumatic growth is spiritual. They begin to explore life's bigger questions, their belief systems, and people can become very religious. They can search out for and live out their life with more purpose and live with more awareness of the impact that they are having in the world. So I promise to share a little secret with you about the most critical ingredient to making post-traumatic growth happen. And it comes from an interview I watched with Dr. Tedeschi, where he talked about his life's work and what he discovered. According to Dr. Tedeschi, the most helpful, the most critical component that can determine whether someone actually experiences post-traumatic growth is the presence of an expert companion. This is someone who will truly listen and take interest in what happened to you. Someone who can be fully present and allows you to think in new and different ways. And yes, an expert companion can be a professional therapist, but it doesn't have to be. Many people can fit this role of being an expert companion. It can be a friend, a family member, a coach, a teacher, or a spiritual leader. In traumatizing professions with a high degree of camaraderie, like military and first responders, it can be a peer who really understands what you've gone through. What I really love about this concept of the expert companion is that it ties in really nicely with the last mechanisms that facilitate post-traumatic growth, which is service. So as you are on the journey from trauma to growth, you can be of service to others by being their expert companion. So to recap, post-traumatic growth is a positive change experienced as a result of the struggle with a major life crisis or traumatic event. There are 5 main mechanisms that foster post-traumatic growth: cognitive processing of the trauma that took place, emotional regulation, where you become in control of your emotions rather than the other way around, disclosure, where you can talk about what happened without it being more than or less than what it was, narrative development, where there is a change in the story of the trauma from negative to positive, and finally service, where it's paying it forward. Of course, there is the incredibly important ingredient to making post-traumatic growth happen, which is the presence of an expert companion. As you go from trauma to growth, you'll likely experience change in one or more of these areas of your life. So personal strength, relationships, openness to new experiences, gratitude, and your spiritual life. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Since you've made it this far, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.